Well, good evening, everybody. We're already a minute past 7. Let's come on in and find our seats, get settled in, and let's get going with our midweek Bible class. I want to review a couple of announcements before Andrew comes up here for the invitation. Just be sure you're looking at the Exhorter Bulletin each week or checking the emails that get sent out. And let's be praying. We got a lot of folks in here that need our prayers. And just in particular, we rejoice with Watkins and June Bird being born healthy, but we want to continue to pray fervently, and I emphasize fervently, for Bodie Jensen and for Allie and Connor, and as we continue to see what develops with the epilepsy that he's been having and the very serious risk that is to his health. And the Jensen family. Hello? That sounds really loud. Okay, we want to be marking in our calendar June 23rd through 27th, VBS. Be sure, again, if you check the bulletin or any posters about it, you'll see a QR code. Just scan that in your phone. Please register your kids. That helps us with our planning for it, and planning is in full swing right now. People are doing all kinds of stuff behind the scenes to make it a good week of encouragement, edification, and education for your kids and for yourself. Parents, you drop your kids off, there's a Bible class for you in the morning that Scott will be teaching each day. And please come back in the evening, the week of VBS, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, hear from some of our elders. It's a real treat to have the shepherds feeding the flock and to be there for that, to hear them teach lessons that fit in with the theme of VBS. One other update I will add, other than, again, just keep checking the list, check in on folks like Steve Johnson, send a text, go visit him. I'm going to try and do that tomorrow myself. But one other update, I failed to mention this last week, but you guys probably noticed that my wife hasn't been here much the last month or two, and she's been really struggling with sickness that just won't go away, and finally got her into a doctor because it wasn't severe, but it wasn't going away, and she's kind of been in bed for a long time and found their conclusion is mono. So she's kind of been off her feet for a while, and she's getting better. And we were glad to see her here on Sunday, but it sounds like it might be quite a few weeks of slowly getting her energy back. So I appreciate your prayers for my wife Jessica as she seeks to recover from that. Elders, do we have anything else we need to bring to the attention of the church? All right. In just a moment, we're going to sing number 167, We Saw Thee Not. And Jason Lee now will dismiss us in prayer, but right now it is Andrew's time to come up here for the invitation.
All right, so I have two types of students in my class. The one type, they desperately need help, they don't understand something they're reading, and I help them out. They ask for help, I see the problem, they ask for help, and then we're all good. The other type of student is they need help, they read it, and they just sit there with this blank look on their face, and they don't do anything. They don't ask for help, and when I go there and try and help them, they same blank expressions, like I'm talking to a wall. The first type of student can be helped. The other type of student takes great restraint not to backhand them. But the basic idea here is both sets of students needed help. Everyone on this planet needs help. The issue is, when you need help, are you going to realize that there's a problem and seek out a solution? Are you going to get up and try and find a solution to the problem? Are you going to ask for help? Because things are never going to get better until you face the problem. For example, is there anyone in here who has not been baptized recently? Has anyone not been baptized yet? Because if you haven't, that's a problem. I'd say that's a pretty big problem, a problem that needs to be addressed. So, turn real quick to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, I'm going to start reading in verse 18. 1 Peter 3, starting verse 18. For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you. Not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. We all need to be saved. We all need to be baptized, because we were just saying that's how we're saved. It's necessary to be saved. But the question still is, are you going to get up and do it? We can keep preaching, we can keep talking to you. You can talk to people in need, but you still have to make the choice yourself. And you still need to take action. And do you see the problem? So, do you believe that Jesus is the Christ? Do you want to be saved? If you're up for that, if you believe that, come forward, we'll stand and sing.
We saw thee not when thou didst come to this poor world of sin and death, nor yet beheld thy cottage home in that despised Nazareth. But we believe thy footsteps trod in streets and plains, thou Son of God. But we believe thy footsteps trod in streets and plains, thou Son of God. We walk not with the chosen few, who saw thee from the earth ascend, no raise to hand their wandering view, then low to earth all prostrate men. But we believe thy footsteps rise, beheld that journey to the skies. But we believe that human eyes beheld that journey to the skies.
Let's pray. Our dear righteous Father in heaven, we are so grateful that we have this time to gather and study from your word. We pray your blessings on our study tonight. We ask that you would bless the teachers and their efforts. Bless us as students to be receptive and attentive, and we pray that your word would reach our heart. We are very mindful, Father, of those who are unable to be here, those that are suffering, those that are dealing with hardship, and we pray that your healing and comforting hand be on them, and help us to be an encouragement to those that we can be. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
All right, let's open up to Job chapter 39. Last week we spent our time in chapters 38 and 39, and we observed how God responds. And that's something interesting to me, at least, that Elihu had been saying all along, that God has no answer for you. He has no need to answer you. God doesn't talk to people like that, Job. And then that's exactly what God does. Now we see that the answers that Job gets are probably not what he was hoping for. And his response at the end of this first speech from God shows you that he understands his error. But as we looked at chapters 38 and 39 last week, we just observed how God answers him. And really the simple approach in chapter 38, he goes through all the elements of creation, all the things that run the earth and things that go on, the cycles of different animals, the life cycles, and just sort of puts Job in the defensive and just says, well, okay, Job, be a man, stand up and let me ask and you give the answers. And I know I greatly disappointed Steve Bird last week. He said, no, we want to spend, he said, I'd be happy if we spend like 3 or 4 weeks on this chapter. And this is a really good description of really, if it's not scientific foreknowledge, which I think a lot of it is, at the very least you could say that the Bible shows it was pretty far ahead of contemporary texts as far as understanding how the world works and some basic rules of science and physics and nature, and it's all kinds of questions and discussion that's right up Steve's alley, and so I'll leave it to him to elaborate on that at some future date or as he's done in the past. But I do think that sometimes we make an overly simple point out of this, though, and I don't want to dismiss it because that is clearly something that is going on, where God is saying, stand up straight, let me ask the questions, you give the answers. Who are you to even ask me such kinds of things? Who are you to presume to know how the world operates and how I work? As if you could reduce me down to some sort of one-sentence thought that you could explain my doings when you don't even know how. You weren't even there when the earth was made. You can't even explain the life cycles of the mountain goats. You don't live up in the mountains with them. Can you go find food for the lions? Like, it's basically just saying, like, Job, you're unqualified, as if I hired an electrician, and I will do very minimal electrical things, but once the voltage goes above 120, I'm not touching it. And I'll ask my father-in-law, and there's things that he won't want to touch, and so we bring an electrician in, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, are you sure you really want to cross those 2 wires like that? He's going to look at me and say, you hired me for this because you don't know what you're doing. You're not qualified to tell me what I'm doing. And that's sort of the impression we get. So that is certainly something that's going on in chapter 38. And again in chapter 39 as he discusses all these different animals, wild animals. So that is certainly an element of what's going on. Job, you aren't qualified to make the grand conclusions that you have. There's so much you don't know. You are so limited compared to me. And that is certainly going on. But I'd like to think that maybe there's something else a little more subtle happening too. And so we talked about this last week, that all these things that he describes, whether it's the creation of the earth, man wasn't there. No man saw that. Whether it is putting the constellations in the sky, no man understands how those were put there. No man saw God put the stars in the sky. Whether we're talking about the wild animals and how they have food to eat, man doesn't take care of them. Or we talk about a bird so dumb like the ostrich that it puts its eggs on the ground and steps on them half the time. Yet the ostrich is not extinct and doesn't need man's help. That's all the arguments he makes. And so for all of that, he's describing things that, yes, are beyond Job's power, but also, I think, another point of emphasis, it's beyond Job's perception. But it all still happened, and all the animals are still taken care of. And I find that to be another point, another layer to this, beyond just God is mighty and Job is limited. I find that to be a more comforting thought too, as maybe a secondary point that God might be making. Especially because we notice that a lot of these animals, donkeys, oxen, ostriches, are all animals that Job has brought up earlier, and he uses them as an example of how alone and untaken care of he is, how neglected he is by God. And it's almost like God is saying, well, I take care of those animals. So if you want to call yourself a donkey, a wild donkey that is neglected, well, you need to think again about that. Just because you don't see the work I've done, or just because you don't see the work that I am currently doing, or any man for that matter, does not mean I am inactive. And so I find that to be a very powerful secondary point to what's going on here in the first speech of God. Any last questions, comments, observations that came up in those two chapters? So as we look ahead to chapter 40, I'm getting flashbacks to being a 10, 12, 14-year-old boy and being lectured by my father. Because I feel like my dad would just go through this lecture, and my brothers and I had this joke that he had a catalog of lectures. I got lecture 15B tonight. Like he just had this whole list, and just whatever occasion, whatever misbehavior we did, he'd bring out some sort of lecture, and we just have to sit there and endure it. But it always felt like I would say the right thing and say, I'm really sorry, I've learned my lesson, I won't do it again. And then he would go into it again. I'm like, well, I said the thing, I said the right thing, why are you still lecturing me? And that's kind of the impression I get here, because chapter 40, moreover the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. I said, well, okay, Job, here's round 2. But Job answers. Look at his answer here, verses 3 through 5. So again, I think Matthew 6, the Sermon on the Mount, really drives home that point there. You can see all the things that God does, and we don't have an explanation for it, or we don't see him doing it all the time, but he's doing it. All those things are taken care of in nature. God's going to take care of us, even if we don't see it. So chapter 40, notice Job's answer here. And yes, with the artwork, that's what we're all anxious to talk about, right? Behemoth and Leviathan. We'll get there in a minute. But look at Job's answer, verse 4. Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yet twice, but I will proceed no further. He's speechless. And he's admitting, I was presumptuous. I said things that I was ignorant or unaware of. I spoke from ignorance. I came to conclusions that were not right. And that's what God is confronting him on back there in verse 2. Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. So Job did not curse God. Job did not sin with his mouth or say something that was, but in his defense of himself, he ended up casting some negativity on God. He ended up casting doubt on God. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I think we'll look back at an example or two. David. Nope. This is the first time God's spoken to him. This is a book about someone suffering and just trying to understand. Trying to understand, why has this happened? His friends assert, you are a sinner. And Job is insisting no. And so in his defense, which isn't wrong because he's right, he's not a sinner. But also, I think he's going to learn some things about God, from God, in these couple chapters. And you ask, why did God do this to him? Well, remember what we've been going over on our Sunday morning sermons through James chapter 1. Suffering is like a test, and a test reveals weaknesses, flaws. And I think this testing of Job has revealed maybe some wrong conclusions about God. Was he a sinner? Certainly not more than his friends. No more than just the fact that none of us are perfect. But was he a sinner deserving punishment? No. But did he have some things to learn that this trial has drawn attention to? Has this revealed maybe some flaws in his thinking that maybe wouldn't have come to the light if he had not gone through this trial? So don't worry. When we get through the end of the text, we're going to spend at least one, maybe even two classes just, let's wrap all this up. Let's talk about all our lingering questions. I'm going to come back to that one of these things must be wrong. Job is righteous, God is good. One of those has to be wrong or a lie. We're going to come back to that big question. So we're going to spend some time. We really want to make sure we do our due diligence in reflecting on the message of this book. So I'll come back to it, but we can start to see here some of the big questions of, well, why did this even happen to Job? It's revealed some things that he got wrong and needs to maybe relearn. And that's reflected in his statement here. It sounds to me like this is very much a courtroom term, by the way. When he says, lay my hand over my mouth, it's just saying, I'm not going to say any more. I've spoken too much, and I'm not going to make it worse by saying more. And he says, I will proceed no farther at the end of this. It's almost like he's saying, from a legal standpoint, I put a charge against God, and I've got my day in court. I'm withdrawing. I'm withdrawing my case. It rests. I got more than I bargained for here. And so he's beginning to realize it. Yet the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and says, now prepare yourself like a man. I'll question you, and you shall answer me. That's exactly how he started the first speech. So I just find that to be a little bit humorous, but also it makes me kind of question, didn't Job say the right things? Yet God says, now stand up and prepare yourself like a man. We're not done yet. I've got more to tell you. I've got more lecture here. More for you to consider, Job. See, Job understands his errors, but he doesn't understand the full truth yet. There's more for him to learn about God. He sees the flaws in himself, but there's more to learn about God. So that's why we keep going here. Any questions or comments about Job's statement here? Scott?
Even when God is dealing with a good man, Job, really we would call him chief sinner, very good man, Job still has to know his place.
Yeah.
Man of God, it's important to him to understand that God is in heaven, we're on earth, therefore let our work be. He said a lot of work. Same kind of thing when God deals with us, children of God. God loves us. But we still have to be reminded once in a while the relative position of us and God. We're not the same class. It's like God starts out with Job. Job, God understands we're not.
Right. So there is definitely that element here of reminding Job his place. And that's what we're going to see here when we talk about whatever mighty creatures these are, behemoth, leviathan. The basic conclusion seems to be, Job, you can't even stand up to these creations of mine. So how could you stand up to me? I created them, and they're too much for you to even stand up to. So there's definitely that element here of putting Job in his place. So very good thoughts there. All right, so the Lord is going to answer him again with that same response. Prepare yourself. Be like a man, stand up. I'm going to ask the questions. You're going to give me an answer. What we need to notice here through verse 14, this is a preface. It's not, oh, where's James? It's not, the clicker's not clicking. Just go forward one. Next point. Ah, there we go. Okay. What we need to notice here, beginning in verse 8, we want to go straight to Leviathan and Behemoth and start talking about these mythical creatures or dinosaurs or whatever they are. But let's understand how God prefaces this discussion, because it's really interesting. He's already talked about animals. Why does he need to talk about two more animals? And for that matter, why does he need to spend an entire chapter? I know he didn't put the chapters there, but as we equate it, an entire chapter on Leviathan, and a pretty good portion of one chapter. I mean, he spends a lot of time on these animals, and this is his big finish. This is his big conclusion to his speech. But I think the way he prefaces the discussion of these two creatures might shed some light on what we're meant to take away from it. So read along with me beginning in verse 8 and think about what is he talking about here, and maybe how does that set the tone for what God will discuss in the rest of these chapters. So beginning in verse 8, would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? So again, that's his chief accusation against Job. Yes, Job, you've been defending yourself, but in doing so, you've been slandering me. So it's not wrong for Job to defend himself, but maybe he went too far to the point where it's slandering God. Have you an arm like God, or can you thunder with a voice like his? And that's to Scott's point. You are not like me. We are not on equal ground here. But notice now, beginning in verse 10, then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor, and array yourself with glory and beauty. As if that's something he could just do for himself. Disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place, hide them in the dust together, bind their faces in hidden darkness. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. All right, what is he asking Job to do? As he prefaces this discussion on Behemoth and Leviathan, what is he asking Job to do here? What two kinds of people is he discussing? The proud? The humble, I think, by implication, but he identifies, wicked, yeah. So verses 11 and 12. Look on everyone who's proud and humble him. That's the instruction. Take the proud and humble him. And then he says in verse 12, tread down the wicked in their place. What is he asking Job to do here?
This is about power. Job, how much power do you have?
How much power?
You do some of these things, and the obvious, it's obvious God saying, these are all these things that I do. If you can do the things that I can do, then I'll go ahead and admit that you can save yourself. But you can't.
Yeah, and that's what he says at the end. Then I'll admit that your own right hand, I'll confess to you that your own right hand can save you. I just like how he's saying, make yourself beautiful and glorious, or adorn yourself with majesty and splendor. But that's what God is. He's asking him, you've accused me, because this began, let's thread some of these points together here. He begins by talking about, you've slandered me. You've accused me of wrongdoing in verse 8. Would you annul my judgment? You question my judgments. You question my sense of right and wrong. You condemn me that you may be justified. You're insinuating that I have miscarried justice with you, that I've done something wrong. So Job, make yourself beautiful and splendid and glorious, and you act as the judge. You go take the proud and make them humble. You go stamp out the wicked. Job, let's see you be the administrator of justice. If you've accused me of mishandling justice or a miscarriage of justice, well, why don't we see if you can just do better? Think about that introduction and maybe consider how what he says about Behemoth and Leviathan might be an explanation of that point right there. Because we want to jump to questions of curiosity. What kind of creatures are these? But I'm not sure it matters so much what our conclusion is about what kind of creatures these are. I think we need to see the bigger point that God is trying to make to Job, and that's about, you're not like me. You can't sit in the judgment seat like I do. You can't administer justice. You can't reign over wickedness and the wicked and the proud the way I do. So, by the way, let me just add this in too. Go back to chapter 24. How has Job slandered God? Let's just make sure we're thorough here. A good example is back in chapter 24. We looked at this last week when talking about one of the donkey passages. But chapter 24 and verse 2, this is, I think, at the heart of what God is what his contention with Job is. So chapter 24, verse 2. Some remove landmarks. They seize flocks violently and feed on them. So he's talking about the wicked here. He's got a complaint about, well, the wicked do bad things, and well, what happens to them? They drive away the donkey of the fatherless. They take the widow's ox as a pledge. They push the needy off the road. All the poor of the land are forced to hide. Indeed, like wild donkeys in the desert, they go out to their work, searching for food. They're destitute now because the wicked have done this. Let's see. Verse 9, some snatch the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge from the poor. They cause the poor to go naked without clothing. So he's just talking about all the miscarriages of justice. Verse 12, the dying groan in the city and the souls of the wounded cry out, yet God does not charge them with wrong. So I think that's one of those passages where we've been sort of looking out for when and where does Job maybe cross a line. I think that might be one of those passages that stuck out to God. And that might be exactly what God is referencing here in this preface to the second speech. All right, you've accused me of wrongdoing. Well, how would you do in my place? So let's move on now to this discussion beginning in verse 15 at whatever creatures we're talking about here. What's different about the discussion of Behemoth and Leviathan than maybe some of the animals we talked about in chapter 39? What are some notable differences? How does he talk about these creatures? Matthew? It seems very poetic to me. And I want to come back to that idea of poetry a little bit later on. Chris? Yeah, he talked about mountain goats, donkeys. Horses were probably the most frightening or intimidating animals from chapter 39, but this is a whole other category that he's describing here. Jim? Yeah, so that's exactly right. These two creatures here are some entirely different category. The way they're spoken about is different. Like through chapter 39, that's all fairly normal and standard language about animals that we understand. The poetic nature of these two chapters, the descriptions of them, even the names, draw sometimes more questions than conclusions. Chris? Yeah. Well, and that's where I think the dinosaur crowd would sort of look at that and lean into that as they were among the first animals made, or we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on the scientific side of it or the curiosity about what exactly are these creatures. We'll entertain a little bit of that discussion, but I don't want to make that the main focus. David? Well, yeah, we'll talk about what symbols could be here in this chapter. I think there's some literal considerations, but I think there's also maybe some more symbolic considerations going on here. Let's read verses 15 through 24. Let's look at Behemoth. Look now at Behemoth. And like I said, even the name itself, it's not a normal animal name. In fact, this isn't even a translation, it's just a transliteration. That means they just took the Hebrew word and just sort of, instead of finding its equivalent in Greek or English for us, they just sort of kept it and didn't really change it. And it just sort of means beast. but it's also in a plural sense. So some people interpret it as beast of beasts, or like mega beast or something. So it's really just what the name implies, or how, as we use the name today. It's just something massive. But what exactly is it? Unlike these other animals, we know what oxen are, we know what donkeys are, we know what ostriches are. But this one, it's the beast. It's some massive beast. And it says, which I made along with you. So there's a point right there we need to highlight too in our minds. So Job, I made you, I made behemoth. You didn't make any of it. So that's a distinction right there. He eats grass like an ox. See now his strength is in his hips. His power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. All right, does anyone have a footnote suggesting what animal this is? Hippopotamus. That's the most common footnote. Anything else besides hippopotamus? I'm just curious. Was that? Elephant. Okay, that's interesting. Or rhinoceros. But hippo seems to be the most common in the footnotes. And that's where I have to sort of chuckle. Samuel? Okay, here's the dinosaur answer. Diplodocus. Yeah. So there is some merit to the dinosaur, but I think there's some other considerations too. But this is one where this is why I say I think maybe trying to pinpoint some literal animal, why didn't he just say hippopotamus? And when he describes his tail like a cedar, you ever seen a hippo's tail? Or even an elephant's tail? It's not a cedar tree. Stephen?
Perhaps the point behind history and like generalities to the names, they're not like animals. They're sort of like there's mighty animals, so it's not the actual animal.
Well, the power is definitely the emphasis here. So we'll work with that for now. Let's just keep going. I just wanted to point that out. Could we be talking about a hippo? Maybe. And from that standpoint, that's the most deadliest animal in all of Africa, by the way, is the hippo. Not lions, not leopards, not crocodiles. It's actually hippos. So they look all cuddly and chubby and cute, but they're ferocious. Especially when they're hungry. I couldn't resist. Was your hand up, Scott?
I'm scratching my face, but I would say that every time I read this, I change my mind what animal it is. Tonight it's elephant.
Yeah. And I have too. So part of me wants I've always read this as dinosaurs until recently, and so I kind of spill the beans on where I'm at. But we'll come back to that in a minute. We'll look at, yeah.
Do you think Job has seen this animal? Is Job familiar?
And that's a good question. Is Job familiar with this animal? Does he need to have seen it to know about it? I mean, has anyone here ever seen a dragon? But we all know what we mean when we talk about a dragon. Mythological it evokes emotions and feelings too, whether it's something he's familiar with or not. Mark, you had a hand up on that. Yeah.
Not going to talk about something the book doesn't know about. So if I fits, it knows exactly what God is talking about this. It impresses on the more God's power.
Yeah. Ryan?
So I'm pretty sure that there would have been creatures like this would have been discussed, even if they weren't still around in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Just like we have lore from even mythological creatures that have been carried around since before the time of Christ. There's been plenty of mythological creatures and folklore and stuff that have been passed down generationally. So it may have been something that was a pre-flood that Noah
Right.
talked about with his kids and got handed down, in old folklore. We don't know.
Well, yeah, and that was kind of my point to Steve's question, and I agree with Mark. God's not going to bring up something that Job has no experience with. But that was sort of my initial point, and I think Ryan was echoing that does that mean Job needs to have eyewitness or firsthand experience with this creature to know about it? So that's where we're kind of go back in circles on this. Let me point something out, and then I'll let Matthew chime in. When we look ahead to Leviathan, that's another one that's very peculiar wording. Large sea creature, or some translations literally will translate the Hebrew as twisting serpent. But does anyone remember back in chapter 26? Good, chapter 26, in verse 13. I remember someone asked me about this. Look at verse 12. Job 26, beginning verse 12. He stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding he breaks up the storm. By his spirit he adorned the heavens, his hand pierced the fleeing serpent. And there's some suggestion in a lot of commentaries that the fleeing serpent was sort of this mythological idea of the serpent that hastens the sun to rise in the morning. That sort of like, well, what holds the earth up? It was Atlas holding it on his back. Like they had all these explanations. And so some of these concepts have already come up in the book of Job that maybe show us that, was it a creature that Job would see firsthand, or was it just something Job understood just through the telling of stories and records or mythology even? So that's where we can kind of go around in circles. But Matthew, then Glenn. Huh. And that's interesting too, like the rivers and the oceans. Do we know if Job's even been to an ocean before, but he knows about them? That's an interesting thought that popped into my head, with not exactly the point you were making, but that's what popped into my head. Glenn? I do. Yeah. Yeah, Isaiah 27, verse 1. So let's just sum up Behemoth. It's massive. You see him in the mountains. He's described as having a tail like cedar, stomach muscles are incredibly powerful, bones like beams of bronze, ribs like bars of iron, the first of the ways of God, and only he who made him can bring near his sword. So you see the point that he's making here is whatever we're discussing here is something that God created, but it is entirely impressive to Job. Job, you can't even compare to my creation. So how do you think you compare to me? I think that's one thing we're meant to see here. Chris? Yeah, that's an interesting comparison there. And I think verse 15 is important, that as I made him, just like I made you. Look at Isaiah 27. So Behemoth, elephant, hippopotamus, diplodocus, if you're Samuel, could be a dinosaur. This is one of those verses that when we get to Leviathan, that's another one, twisting serpent. Look at Isaiah 27 and verse 1. In that day the Lord with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Well, there's that expression again from Job. It seems to imply some sort of mythological element there. Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Or your translation might say dragon. Maybe you can see where I'm going to go with this as a possible symbolic interpretation. Because when we look at Leviathan, he's described very much like a dragon. Some would say a crocodile, and that seems to be the likeliest, if we want to pin it down to some sort of animal that we're familiar with. But it also describes him as having smoke from his nose and shooting sparks out of his mouth and lasers from his eyes, practically. I mean, it sounds kind of ridiculous here, the way he's described, but very dragon-like. Are dragons real? It's interesting how many cultures. I remember, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Don Patton. He's come here a few times, and he goes around the country and does lectures about scientific evidences in the Bible, and in particular with paleontology and finding bones in the ground and things like that, geological evidence and things like that. And I just remember him sort of talking about this point that so many cultures have dragons, ancient artwork, ancient depictions, whether it's pottery or murals on a wall of dragons, and just how peculiar that is. But do we think dragons were ever real? It's just funny how many cultures recognize the idea of dragons, these flying serpents that shoot fire out of their mouth, but scientifically, no one really thinks they were actually real. But it was very prevalent out there. Well, let's see. We are running short on time. Go ahead, Steve.
I know I'm backing up to the human for just a second, but
Yeah, that's fine.
notice how God introduces behemoth. He says, behold. Then when he introduces Leviathan, he says, consider. It's not out of the realm of possibility that as they're having this conversation, behemoth is walking by.
Oh, certainly. Certainly.
God made that happen.
Yeah.
And, we have to kind of watch out. We've been influenced by a lot of bias. And when we start to think, well, this can't be a dinosaur because it's post-flood and blah, blah,
Yeah.
all those rules are out.
Yeah. I'm afraid.
All man-made rules, but they're man-made ideas. And just try and open your mind and just read what the book says.
Yeah.
God said, hey, look at that thing right there.
Yeah.
Look at how I made it. That's possible.
I go back and forth on that because I don't want to be too eager on the other side of that coin and start looking for some sort of proof or evidence and maybe see something that I want to be in there. I think so, and I'm not saying that's what happens in this text, but I think I've seen some examples where people are like, well, the Bible knows science before science did. It's like, well, that's not really what it's saying. It just sort of sounds like it, but that's not. It doesn't prove the point you think it does. I don't know that that's what's going on here, but
Right, and I'm not trying to prove any point.
yeah.
I'm trying to open up
Yeah.
the options.
I am not ruling out that there, and that's what I think of with Jesus, like with the parables. Well, look at this gardener. I think there actually was a guy out there scattering seeds in the dirt, and Jesus said, "Look at him." So I think that is a very valid point and a very likely.
The footnotes that we have, you pointed out Leviathan, footnote, behemoth, hippo,
Yeah.
and alligator. Those are, again, put in there by a man. And many times men are, they can be held prisoner by what they know about,
Right,
what they see.
right.
Again, watch out for little things like that, clues that were
Yeah.
inserted by a man.
And that's something that the reference to Leviathan in Isaiah, and I'll get to you next, Ryan. The reference to Leviathan in Isaiah is one of those where it fits with Job, because Job is, I don't know when it was written, but when it took place was very, very, very early in the narrative or in world history. Could this have been pre-flood? Possibly. Could it have been post-flood before all the dinosaurs were gone? Possibly. Isaiah was 700 years before Christ. So that reference there casts a little doubt on it, but doesn't obliterate the interpretation that could be dinosaurs. That's all I'm trying to say is I have a hard time deciding, and I'm like Scott, I kind of change every time I read it. Ryan, and then we'll come back over here to Scott.
So when we start talking about the difference between the word dinosaur and dragon, the word dinosaur is a fairly modern term that does not date back that far. The word dragon, I personally believe, has been used throughout to describe these monstrous reptilian creatures that
Yeah,
we consider to be dinosaurs. And if you look at most of the depictions of them, it's just like anybody. If you slay one, you're going to exaggerate. It's like a fisherman. Oh, it was this big.
yeah,
No.
yeah.
It may have been a 20-foot crocodile that they killed, but he's going to dress it up with bat wings and spikes on the tail and who knows what else.
Yeah, and sometimes the language about breathing fire, some people have associated that with, well, it's venomous and it burns. So it kind of became mythologized to, well, it burned me. Well, that must have breathed fires. That's where some people get some of those connections. I like the idea of the fishing story.
But we also have issues with, like, the Komodo dragon has a very toxic bite, and there could have been some, although it's not fire, its bite will kill you within 24 to 48 hours.
Right.
So some connotation with that, maybe having some.
Exactly. Scott?
Just to make it even more complicated,
I was about to say, let's bring it back down to earth. Do it.
in the Proverbs, Isaiah 27, Leviathan flings forth. Think of Leviathan, serpent. Genesis chapter 3, number 1, serpent. Revelation 12, the dragon. Those could be veiled reference.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I wanted to go with this. And I'm not going to say it is this or it is this. I'm going to present an option. Chew on this, and we'll come back to this next week. Stan, I'll let you get a word in before the bell rings. But
We see here in discussion two strong problems, yet later in paragraph, planning, he's not afraid of anything.
right. Yeah. So, and that's something to consider. We'll look at the actual language because we're just about out of time, but let me just put this thought out there to chew on. There are a lot of scriptures that talk about creatures. In the book of Revelation, we've got the dragon, chapter 12. The serpent of old, there's always that connection there. And what does the dragon do in the next chapter in Revelation 13? Let's see who was paying attention last year when we were in Revelation. Chapter 13, the dragon calls two other beasts from where? One from the sea, one from the land. That sounds interesting. Daniel chapter 7. Okay, Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has this vision, and he talks about different world empires. And what are they pictured as in his vision in chapter 2? What's that? Not yet. Chapter 2. Statue. Different materials, different building materials. But chapter 7, Daniel sees the same vision about the same kingdoms, but they're described as really weird, but very powerful and frightening animals. We do this even today. What's the animal that represents America? Eagle, right? What about Russia? It's a bear. We just know that. Animals can represent bigger things than just that literal animal. Chris? Managing the world. That's really where I want to take this. Let's go back to the preface. How did he preface this conversation on these creatures? Job, why don't you rule over the world for a day? Why don't you administer justice? Why don't you take the proud and make them humble? Could this be a symbolic description of how God manages chaos, wickedness, pride? And again, think back to what is God trying to prove here? Is he just trying to prove, Job, you're little and I'm giant? I'm so much more powerful, you're so much more finite. Yes, that is something he is proving, but do you think that's all God is trying to get across to Job? Maybe there's some other subtle teachings going on here as well. Does Job have any clue about the protection that God gave him in chapters 1 and 2 from Satan? Does God have any clue about how God manages the forces of evil and wickedness? Yes, he allowed Satan to do some horrible things, but he also protected Job on some level as well. And it's like maybe if these creatures are a personification or a symbolic representation of the forces of chaos, and there's some, if you want to take a deep dive, go read some of the mythologies in Egypt about Horus and Set and the symbolism of hippos and crocodiles there and representing the forces of chaos. And this could just be the way we talk about animals representing a bigger thing than just that animal, or he could just be talking about, look at this giant animal here. It could be either one of those. I just wanted to bring up maybe another take to consider that might add another layer. So chew on that, and we'll look at chapter 41 next week, consider Leviathan, and then Job's response in chapter 42. We're going to spend a good deal of time just on those 5 or 6 verses there in chapter 42. I planned it this way, believe it or not. I wanted several weeks to really take our time at the end. Speech after speech after speech, 3 times in a row for each of these guys. It got a little monotonous. I wanted to speed through that, but this is where we want to slow down and really take our time to ask the questions and observe what is God trying to teach us here. Thank you, everybody.